Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for providing this opportunity. Thank you to all of the conference organizers. This is just a really fantastic gift to be able to talk about things constructively and critically. I'm going to try to share the slideshow. I doubt I will have any more luck than the others, but we'll see what we can do.
That's great.
All right. Looks like we might be working. But now I've lost my notes. Bear with 1 second. All right, here we go. Sit and listen, and you will see what heaven is like. Over 20 Samoan elders sat around one long table, well, actually several tables pushed together in this small room. And the man who had given the invitation to sit and listen stood at the head of the table next to a PowerPoint projector that hummed its quiet drone. The elder raised his hand and counted off the group, Tosi, Lua, Tolu, Fa, and a chorus of harmonizing voices reverberated through the bodies, hearts, and space between all of us sitting in that room. One function of prophets is to paint evocative images of a future paradise. This is evident in varying apocalyptic and heavenly visions described across both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Digital technology has only accelerated the pace of technological self-replication and the subsequent reshaping of human values. My ethnographic research, part of my PhD, was sparked by Stephen Garner's 2020 call for those missing voices to be included at the table in discussions of digital theology. So my project brings together different groups of minority Christians in order to trace the teleological undercurrents that shape reflection on digital culture in light of cultural identity and faith. If Schweitzer was right, and that when one cannot help but imagine Christ according to one's own culture and ideology, so too must utopia be colored by one's own position in time, space, and place. And so a comparative analysis of eschatological imagination among minority groups reveals the tension between ties to land, place, and bodies in our shared digital world. In this paper, I'm going to argue that contemporary eschatological reflection can operate prophetically by disrupting the self-serving teleology inherent in digital culture. Eschatological reflection brings into focus the relationships between things penultimate and ultimate, allowing individuals and communities to gauge and negotiate their own adaptation, adoption, or abandonment of digital technologies. And so here's a little bit of a roadmap. We're going to start with a little bit of framework, a little bit of methodology, and then we're going to look at 2 case studies, looking at a group of queer Christians and then a group of Samoan Christians. And then lastly, we'll offer some final thoughts on in conclusion. So to start off with the framework, all of us here today, I'm sure, are familiar with a lot of the work in digital theology, and we all owe an immense debt to the scholarship of the likes of Peter Phillips, Heidi Campbell, Stephen Garner, Brian Brock, Jonas Kurlberg, Kate Ott, Jana Bennett, and Tim Hutchings. These are the scholars that have influenced my work, and these groundbreaking pioneers have done excellent work laying out frameworks for research, taxonomy for clarity in the discussion, and innovative methodological rigor and depth, helping us enter further and further into the exploration of the human technological relationship. So my work leans into the third and fourth definitions of digital theology that Phillips, Shiver Film Guerrero, and Curlberg offered in their 29 article outlining 4 definitions. And the third definition they offer is intentional, sustained, and reflexive theologically resourced engagement with digitality/digital culture. And the fourth definition, a prophetic reappraisal of digitality in the light of theological ethics. And so I take as a given that technology has its own set of values and its own teleological bend. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his essay Inheritance and Decay notes, quote, "Technology became an end in itself," end quote. In that same 2020 article I referenced earlier, Dr. Garner noted that humans are being colonized by technology, a metaphor he repeats with his article with Terry Puono on the digital Va. This framing of new media and digital culture as a colonizing force opens a productive analytical space whereby some of the fuzziness around the concept of digitality dissipates through teleological comparison. This framework aligns well with the school of media ecology, informed by scholars such as Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, Jacques Ellul, and Lance Straight. Identifying digital media as a prevailing communication environment gives us room for both human and divine agency, while acknowledging the affordances and media biases within digitality that subtly and sharply shape human behavior and thought. The metaphor of colonization affords us the ability to name the ways individual technologies and platforms connect to a larger way of being in the world, and then chase congruences and conflicts in the space of encounter. All right, so that's a framework, a few thoughts on method. Similar to Heidi Campbell's method of tracing the ongoing negotiation of communities and new technologies in what she calls RSST, or the religious social shaping of technology, my research method engages in ethnographic theology, following Natalie Wigg-Stevenson and James Bielo, among others. This approach acknowledges Bourdieu's assertion that the researcher always constructs their object of study. With the guidance and encouragement of leaders within the communities inviting me to research among them, we co-designed culturally informed workshops exploring digital theology. These workshops varied in locale and exact format, but all involved sharing a meal and were between 2 and 3 hours long. There were 2 workshops for queer or rainbow Christians, one with Samoan elders living in New Zealand, and then one with Māori Christians or indigenous Christians to New Zealand in rural Waikato. In addition to these workshops, I performed one-on-one semi-structured in-depth interviews with participants from each community, some of whom had been involved in a workshop, some who had not. When possible, I conducted these conversations in person, but due to illness or distance, a handful of interviews were conducted via Zoom. And so these conversations, the relationships and reflections all form my field of research. While I did ask participants about their digital footprints, I did not gather any data from their social media or digital devices other than what they offered to share during or after the interview process. The reason for this is twofold. First, any in-depth examination into a single technological platform gives the project a shelf life tied to the popularity and economic solvency of a particular phenomenon. And secondly, I'm more interested in digital culture than any particular technology, following Heidegger in noting that, quote, "the essence of technology is by no means anything technological." So now that I've given a sketch of the framework and talked a little bit about methodology, let us turn to the fun stuff of the case studies. So case 1, the first group I gathered was a cohort of queer Christians. I know that the term queer is contested in the literature, and I'll use queer and rainbow interchangeably. Rainbow is rainbow and queer were the 2 words that the participants in my group largely used to self-identify to refer to a broader coalition of LGBTQIA plus or gender and sexual minorities. So in one interview, I spoke with a gay man called Steve. He and his partner, Andrew, are both faithful Christians who have stayed in the church despite the myriad of voices they've encountered both in person and online, saying that they have no part in the kingdom of God. Steve described the most recent episode in the ever-ongoing saga of Christians pushing them away. Earlier that summer, they were traveling through New Zealand when they stopped at a beautiful church overlooking a lake. There at that moment, they found in the lake, the mountains, and the small chapel overlooking the water, a magnetic pull on their spiritual, emotional, and physical being. They each felt a special tether to this place, individually and communally. While that particular church was not their spiritual home, the two are both very involved in their local church and are deeply religious and deeply spiritual. Once they became engaged, they told this story to the minister of the church on the lake, explaining who they were, the connection they felt to the place, and their desire to have a minister bless their marriage in this church. But the church said no. Basically, they said, sorry, but you can't have your blessing here because of your sexuality. Now, you may be thinking a bit of a bummer of a story, but the exclusion of gay Christians within the church is nothing new. But here's the thing, because it's such a scenic and iconic church, it shows up all over social media, across the internet, in ads. It's everywhere. The picture shown is an image generated by AI. It's not the actual church, but it's similar to something like this. And so I sat in Steve's living room and I asked him about his feelings and thoughts when he encounters these digitally mediated images of this church. This place that could easily become a symbol and stand-in for the homophobia enshrined in an unwelcoming institution that refused to recognize his and his partner's love. He laughed and he explained that he does not try to avoid seeing images of that church on the lake. He said, "It's still a special place for us. So that church is still a special place. It still feels like the place we should be getting married, and that church feels holy to us. And so it's a little symbol of the not yet, that God's kingdom is here, but it's not yet, you know, there is stuff to come. And there's a sense of sadness there, but also a sense of hope, right? Of what it can be." Theologically, one could say that Steve is putting on those biblical lenses of apocalyptic theology described by J. Lewis Martin. Or perhaps to turn to a more modern metaphor, one might say he's viewing the present through an augmented reality lens. This isn't virtual reality where what is physically and materially there disappears. Rather, the pain and reality of the present is acknowledged, but another world is also equally present. It is this view of reality that allows Steve and Andrew to live into a life that does not allow reactionary anger, bitterness, nor resentment to fester. Instead, this eschatological framing allows the couple to lean into love for the church, even when faced with lack of that same love. So what makes this queer theology and not just theology? Sabrina did a brilliant job of outlining what queer theology is, so I will just skip right over this. And so in this case of queer eschatology, through this augmented reality perspective, Steve's very perception of place around him was transformed and revisioned. Steve's queer eschatology allows him to see the church as a holy, sanctified place, maintaining its sacrality and specialness. It simultaneously stands as a reminder that there is work to be done in the here and now to bring about that prophetic vision into the current material reality. How am I on time? I don't know if I noticed when I started. What time do I need to wrap up?
Sorry, I struggled finding my mute button. You probably got another 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Okay, cool. All right, we have to shortchange the Samoans, but we'll get through this quickly. So I sat there with the Samoans. They came to the end of their talanoa, a Pacific form of conversation on digital theology and Samoan culture. The conversation swayed between the acknowledgements of the benefits of digital technology, but also the perils and dangers. One of the main themes to emerge in the discussion was the use of values as signposts or markers of cultural preservation. Elders expressed worries that the values of love, open discussion, nurturing sacred relational space, service, respect, and discipline were not being properly translated into the digital sphere. They noted that cultural change always happens, but digital technology has accelerated that change at a dizzying pace. Those Samoan values of love, service, obedience, respect, and respect for roles of leadership all start in the body. They can extend into the digital sphere, but the heart of these values is in the way they are performed in synchronous time and material space. The embodied singing of a song in a room full of others, as the limitations of synchronizing sounds such as singing, chanting, or prayers on Zoom showed, is not yet replicable in the digital world. And so as they sang, the songs filled the room in a way that was more than the sum of each person's individual voice. So it is with culture and community. This is what heaven is like, they said. There is another reality present. A door opens into a new place of being, a new place where those moments of singing and harmony emerge, creating heaven on earth. Now we've heard a brief snippet from 2 case studies on the power of eschatology to interrupt the present shock of digital culture. Let us conclude with a few final reflections on the doors these 2 cases open into growing our understandings of the relationship between humans and technology. The prophets in this story are not calling down fire on altars drenched in water. They are not sharing visions of a moon turning to blood, rapture, or a time when all the dead will rise. The prophetic function is fulfilled when groups of Christians gather and give time and energy into intentional and sustained theological reflection on the ways digital culture intersects with cultural and theological values. In the example of Steve and Andrew, we saw a queer eschatology that expanded the church instead of reducing it to a binary of inclusion and exclusion. With the Samoan elders, we saw a Pacifica eschatological frame that insists on an embodied, relational, and incarnational priority in the elevation of physical and material cultural expressions. Digital technologies affect different groups of people differently. Christianity is not and never has been monolithic, univocal. And so within Christianity, minority groups find their own forms of resistance, asynchronous delinquency, and détournement amidst the colonizing wave of digitality. Thank you.